1970s through the 2000s. I'm going to end this lecture with the Obama administration instead of the Trump administration because the Trump administration has only been in for a few years and we don't quite know where it's going to fit into the fabric of history yet. This is a photograph of Gerald Ford. He took over as president after Nixon resigned. Ford unfortunately inherited the anger of Nixon, I guess you will say, and in part because Ford pardoned Nixon. Nixon was supposed to be indicted after he left office, but Ford pardoned him, and he did so because he felt it was for the good of the country, that the American people had been through so much with the Watergate investigation, and he just wanted the country to heal, which in the end kind of ended up being kind of a big mistake for him, but nonetheless, that's what he did. During his administration, inflation was very high. We had an oil crisis. In fact, we have an oil shortage with long lines at the gas pump. The auto industry struggled. So there was a lot of just really economic upheaval during Ford's administration. I also wanted to mention, this has nothing to do with Ford, but during kind of the same time period, we have disco, so we kind of have a change in the youth culture. What had once been, Elvis and kind of the clean cut culture moved into the hippie culture, moved into the disco culture. And yes, I was a big part of the disco culture. I am proud to say I owned a double Bee Gees album. When you open the cover up, it had all three Bee Gees in the middle of it. So I was a big fan of disco. In 1976, Jimmy Carter will beat Gerald Ford, primarily because of the economics at the time and because a lot of people felt that Ford was part of the corrupt Nixon administration, so it kind of part of a hangover of that. And Carter was kind of a refreshing candidate in many people's minds. Carter was an outsider. He was a Washington outsider. He had been governor of Georgia, but he grew up on a peanut farm. He was a peanut farmer. He was a Democrat. He was a Christian from the South. He believed in human rights and pushed for them around the world. He's still alive and still does that, particularly with his establishment of the Carter Center. And there was a concern amongst the American people that he was not focusing on the economy because we had a great deal of inflation. We still had oil crisis and oil shortages and long lines at the pumps. So people were really struggling economically, and it was felt that he wasn't really addressing all of those things. But one of his major accomplishments was the Camp David Accords in 1978. This is where Carter brokered a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, which was considered a major coup at the time. That this was peace in the Middle East has always been an issue and a very difficult thing to do, and he managed to do it. It only lasted a very short time, but he did do it, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize as a result. But the main crisis that's really going to plague Jimmy Carter during his presidency is the Iran hostage crisis in 1979. What had happened was there was a revolution in Iran. Their government was overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists. They forced the leader of the country, the Shah, out of Iran. He will end up taking refuge in the United States.
In response to that, their new government kidnapped 53 American hostages from the Tehran embassy. It was the U.S. policy not to negotiate with terrorists. Instead, Carter will order a secret rescue operation to try to get the hostages out of the embassy, but it failed, and it failed badly. This was very embarrassing for Carter because it made him look like a weak foreign policy president. And the hostage situation just was constantly on the minds of the American people. And I remember this very well because every night, Walter Cronkite, which was the really well respected CBS evening news anchor, would end every news program with day 55 of the hostage crisis, day 111 of the hostage crisis. So, what he was doing, he was reminding everybody every single night that we had hostages in an embassy that our president, our administration, couldn't get released. And it really just was really difficult for Carter's administration. Is a picture of some of the hostages. They were ultimately released. And it wasn't as if President Carter wasn't working on the release, because he had been, but he never really got credit for the release of those hostages. Those hostages were released right after this man, President Ronald Reagan, was elected. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. So Jimmy Carter was only a one-term president. Between the oil crisis, the hostage situation, Carter just could not withstand the election against a very kind of popular governor, Ronald Reagan. He was actually California's governor. He was also a former actor. But after he takes office, they released the hostages. And they knew that he was being elected president. And they actually had the hostages on the tarmac ready to go and waited till he was until Reagan was inaugurated before they released him. So Reagan always got credit for getting the hostages out when it really was President Carter who actually got them out. Reagan was a conservative, and he really did a good job of restoring American confidence. For one, he gets credit for the hostages being freed. He really runs on this what it's like to be an American, kind of restored people's patriotism. He was everybody's grandfather. He was very charismatic. You really listened to him when he spoke. So he was very good at getting the American people to trust him. He kind of was like FDR in that way. Very good at that. Now, Reagan believed what's referred to as the trickle-down theory. They also called it Reaganomics during his administration. And what the trickle-down theory is, and I believe I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, is that the administration gave tax breaks to businesses. And those businesses were supposed to take the money they saved with those tax breaks and put it back into their business, meaning they had the money to hire people. And this was supposed to be a job creator. But it doesn't quite always go that way, because you can't force businesses to put the money back into the businesses. Some businesses will just pocket that money and give it as profit, either for themselves or to their shareholders. But that's the theory behind it anyway. Ronald Reagan spent a lot of money on defense. This is, of course, during the Cold War. He promoted something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, and it was a defense system where it used lasers to knock out missiles. Reagan was very anti communist, very pro military, really is not interested in balancing the budget, so he spends a lot on defense, which we had been really doing since really the Korean War. He slashed social welfare programs. One of the big crises that happens during his administration is the AIDS epidemic, which he really turns a blind eye to. At least he does in the beginning. He was not interested in that. He had the support of the religious right. There was talk that AIDS was being blamed on, people who were immoral and not Christian and all of these things, which none of course, were true. But he just really didn't really do much until he was kind of forced into it a little bit later um, in his presidency. And it was mostly because the AIDS epidemic really started in the gay community, but really, and at first was thought of as this so-called gay disease, which it was not, but it really spread into the heterosexual world, and then there became outcry, and then that's really when he started putting some money into it. So he wasn't really good with domestic issues. But again, we're right in the middle of the Cold War, and that's what the American people wanted at the time. And he was elected to 2 terms and became a really popular president. There is one scandal or major scandal that he's really involved in, and that is the sale of weapons. It's called the Iran Contra crisis, and basically what had happened is the U.S. had bought weapons from Iran, um, sold it to the Contras in South America to help fight for. They were rebelling against their what they saw as an oppressive government, and so there was a big trial over it. This is Ollie North, who ended up taking the fall for the entire crisis. Reagan testified during the trial. A lot of it was I don't recall. In his defense, it was not known to American people at the time, but he did have Alzheimer's. So we don't know how much of that was him dodging the issue, and how much it was him actually probably not being aware of it or not remembering. Reagan had brought an end to the Cold War, and after his second term, his predecessor was George H.W. Bush, which had been Reagan's vice president. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. government's focus turned to the Middle East. During George H.W.'s presidency, we had the Kuwaiti War. The Kuwaiti War was not a very long war. It really only lasted a few days. In fact, the operation was longer than the war itself. But what had happened was Iraq had invaded Kuwait. They were told not to do so. U.S. troops and others went in to protect Kuwait, and in the end, Iraq surrendered. And the U.S. did not go in to get Saddam Hussein or do any type of regime change or anything like that. It was just over in a few days. George H.W. Bush ended up being a 1-term president, and that was primarily because he was not focused on domestic issues. It's very unusual for presidents who win wars not to be
be elected to a second term, but he wasn't. And it was mostly because people felt that he had not focused on domestic issues and people were hurting economically and they wanted to change. And so he was not reelected. He lost to this man, President Clinton, whom you occasionally see in the news, probably more recently because his wife, Hillary Clinton, ran for president. Bill Clinton was the governor, of Arkansas. He had been a two-term governor, but it wasn't consecutive terms because he won the governorship and then he lost to a Republican and then he won again in after that. So he was a Democrat, a very leftist Democrat. I've actually met him a couple of times. I grew up in Arkansas and he was governor, and you would go see him in the Capitol, and you got to meet him. That was part of a couple of field trips that I had. So, and it's a very small state as well. But he really kind of came out of nowhere for people. He wasn't really even on people's radars for to become president. He had given a keynote speech, a very long keynote speech, and that was where at a Democratic convention, and that's what he was kind of known for. Um, but he, but he's very charismatic. He was a Rhodes Scholar, very human rights, domestic issues, uh, change kind of guy. So he wins. Um, but he does well. Probably in the beginning of his presidency, because he's a Washington outsider, he kind of had some problems with Congress, and he had to kind of meet him in the middle and become more of a moderate. But what happens is he gets involved in a scandal, which was unfortunate in some ways because economically the country was doing very well. He had managed to balance the budget. We had the dot-com craze, the internet and technology was all up and coming. So economically, his presidency was going very well, but he will become plagued with sex scandals. The first one being Jennifer Flowers, have you seen here? Um, um, and this is back when it was considered a bad thing for uh, presidents or presidential candidates to be having extramarital affairs. Uh, but and all of these affairs were fairly well known. At least they were to people that I knew in Arkansas. That he was known to have extramarital affairs, and then he was still elected. That's up to you what you think of that. But this was in the past this would have been you have to get out of the race, but not with him. So this is one of the affairs, and a lot of these affairs come out as a result of him being investigated. There was something called the Whitewater scandal, where he and Hillary Clinton had been partners in a law firm, and there was some concern over whether he had been on the up and up, whether he had broke some rules, whether he had been involved in some corrupt activities. So they order a special prosecutor can star to investigate him, and then out of this whole Watergate scandal comes all these sexual affairs scandals. Hers being one of the first. Paula Jones was another one. He supposedly brought her up to his hotel room. And then this is the one that people probably remember the most was Monica Lewinsky. She was a White House intern, and that they had sexual relations and had an affair while he was in the Oval Office, while she was an intern. So this became a very big scandal. I mean, she was of consenting age, but in the end, what happened was he testified about whether he had had sex with Monica Lewinsky, and he lied and said he didn't. And ultimately, he does get impeached. Again, impeachment doesn't mean that you are kicked out of office. It just means that there's hearings will start in the House, and then the Senate will vote on whether to kick a president out or not. So the charges were abuse of power and lying under oath and all of those things. And he actually is reelected after the impeachment. He is reelected to a second term, but he is very marginalized after that because of the scandal. Still, really kind of haunted him after that. But he wins out in an impeachment. He had the votes. After the Carter's second term, there will be a presidential race between Al Gore and George W. Bush. George W. Bush being him, Al Gore being the gentleman on the right. There was a very big controversy in their presidential election, and it really came down to Florida. And it was very, very close. And Gore needed Florida to win the Electoral College. And there was some issues, what they called hanging chads, like the machines weren't working correctly, and uh, ballots being designed poorly, and it was confusing voters. And I believe it came down to like within 500 votes ultimately that Gore lost by. But this ended up, going up to the Supreme Court because uh, the Bush team sued and wanted the counting to be stopped because it was recount after recount after recount. And ultimately, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court usually doesn't take those kind of cases because they generally don't like to interfere in elections. But for whatever reason, they did. They said it was for the health of the country and so forth. But in the end, they stopped the recount, which meant Al Gore lost the election. So it was a very major uh, controversy and kind of a test of our electoral process because Al Gore had also won the popular vote, which kind of was kind of controversial when Bush came in with respect to his legitimacy as president and and so on. George W. Bush becomes president, and many of you may he may be the first president that many of you remember. I'm not sure if all of your age groups, but for many people, he was probably the earliest president people remember. Takes over wins the election of 2000, and of course, very early on into his presidency, this happens. This is 9/11. 9/11 is still really for me hard to talk about because it was so difficult to watch. Can remember where I was on 9/11. I was getting up to go to work, having my breakfast, and this came on television where the first plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers. And at first, nobody really knew what it was. Nobody knew that it was an attack. People just thought maybe a plane had gone rogue from the airport and had accidentally crashed into the tower. But then when the second plane came in, which is when I started watching television, I saw the second plane come in. And it was horrible. And it wasn't the only two planes. It was in Pennsylvania. And there was, they tried other things as well. And what happened was it was planned by Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And they had trained as pilots and intentionally crashed these airplanes. One hit the Pentagon, another one went down in Pennsylvania because the passengers on board fought back. It was just a horrible, horrible day. Nobody knew what to do. And it was just a really sad day for the country and for the world for a very long time. It's still very hard to look at it. It's for some people, they remember where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot. For others, they remember where they were when Pearl Harbor was bombed. But I remember where I was when 9/11 doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but it was. It was back in the early 2000s. And in the aftermath of 9/11, there were a lot of changes. The Patriot Act was implemented, which meant that the U.S. government didn't have to get warrants to tap your phone. That they had a suspicion that they could just go ahead and listen in to all these conversations. It was a very controversial act. You had the no-fly list, where people with certain last names or were deemed, they have to be checked at before they could board an airplane. So if you were Muslim, and it was a good chance that you were going to be stopped at the airport and talked to, or maybe not even allowed to fly. I mean, at first it was this massive frenzy of people being scared and people really going overboard. Um, Also, after 9/11, you know, Bush implements these uncivil tactics at Guantanamo Bay, like waterboarding and all these torture tactics, which the U.S. has never been a proponent of, but they did. They treated a lot of the Muslims and Middle Easterners at Guantanamo Bay. They held them without real cause, and they held them for a long time, and without trials and lawyers and all kinds of horrible things. And they did it in the name of, well, we have to keep America safe. That was really the rationale. And then, not too long after 9/11, the U.S. Gets involved in the Iraq War, also kind of called the Second Gulf War, but mostly called the Iraq War. And it was believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, is what they said, and that we needed to get rid of Saddam Hussein, that he needed to be taken out of power. Some people were suspicious because there was a lot of people that believed that HW should have gone all the way into Iraq and taken out Saddam Hussein and did a regime change, and didn't. And this was kind of his son's revenge for that. But who really knows what their reasoning was. But it turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And what ends up happening is we ended up taking out Saddam Hussein. Of these changes in the aftermath of 9/11 was done because of fear. Just like events that we've already talked about, such as the Red Scare of World War I, the National Origins Act, and the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, Japanese internment, and then the Second Red Scare or McCarthyism after World War II and during the Cold War. What the aftermath of 9/11 has in common with these events is fear. People were motivated by fear and acted out of fear. During George W. Bush's administration, we had the Tax Relief Act of 2001, which was basically tax cuts mostly for wealthier individuals. The national debt rose to $8 trillion by the second term, in part because we are in a war. There was a recession, and this was something I lived through, and maybe some of you did, or maybe some of your family members did, or your parents. This was a very bad economic downturn, a recession, where the banking and auto industry were collapsing. We had high unemployment, housing prices go down. There was a lot of foreclosures, a lot of homes who went out what they call underwater, which the home is worth less than you owe on it. A lot of people, became homeless. They were living in tent cities, something kind of equivalent to a Hooverville that we talked about uh, during the Great Depression. I mean, it wasn't the Great Depression, but it had the potential to go into the Great Depression. But fortunately, the U.S. was pulled out of that. W. Bush kind of started that process, and then Obama took over. And he took over at a time when the economic outlook was very, very poor. And we had something like 8% unemployment, or maybe maybe it was even up to 10. I don't quite remember, but he took over in a really uh, low or a really bad economic downturn. So he, President Barack Obama, will be elected 2008. He will become the first African American president. I guess his major legacy was be the ACA, or it's also known as Obamacare, and it was very controversial at the time. It's still somewhat controversial, where he wanted to give everybody health insurance, but the end result of that was that insurance prices uh, rose for pretty much everyone. And he put a mandate on it that you had to have insurance. Companies were required to provide health insurance. So the upside was is that everybody had health insurance, so the cost at the hospitals went down. In other words, if you don't have insurance and you go to the hospital, somebody has to pay for that. And if the person can't pay for that, then it ends up being the hospitals paying it, and then that ups the prices with respect to the insurance companies, and it's this kind of a whole long and sordid deal. But but the downside was is that a lot of people's insurance doubled. But an upside to it was that it covered pre-existing conditions, meaning insurance company couldn't deny you health care or deny you health insurance because you had a pre-existing condition. And I know this because my son had asthma and he had a pre existing condition. So this was helpful to someone like me, and it was helpful to a lot of people. But I think the big concern now is, how do we get the insurance costs down? So that's probably a big part of his uh, legacy. And I believe DACA was another part of a legacy. It was it's called the Dreamers Act, whereas if you were going to college and you were not born in the United States, or you were considered undocumented, that you were allowed to continue to live here and go to college. But that's also been challenged recently, um, unfortunately, as well. He is going to be the last president that I talk about, or that I'm going to mention, because a lot of his legacy still hasn't necessarily been part of the fabric of history. Oftentimes, you don't know how a president impacts a country until many, many years or even decades later. So that's where I'm going to end this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.